topic is risk management. The term risk is associated with it a connotation of negativeness and uncertainty. Risk may be defined as a possibility of a loss, okay? And the project lists are uncertain events which, if they occur, will have an unexpected, usually negative effect on the project's objective. So, risks are taken because associated with the risks are opportunities. An organization accepts only those risks which are balanced with the reward that may be gained by accepting the risks. Okay. So, risk of adopting a fast track schedule, is taken with the intention of early completion. That means the time to complete is reduced, and you are taking a risk that in the event something goes wrong, you may need to redo that particular job. So, organizations and individuals, balance the risks and the opportunities. This implies that different organizations do not look at all the risks in the same way. So, different organizations will have a different level of risk tolerance, and some may be risk averse and some may be risk prone. Of course, you have a in between category of people being risk neutral. Now, risk conditions are those aspects of project environment that could contribute to the risks. Okay. Some simple examples are, say, poor quality of project management, dependency on external partners, okay, working on a technology which is not yet well established, are some of the examples, which could lead to such problems. The known risks of any particular project therefore can be managed, but whereas the unknown risks, cannot be managed. So, the unknown risks, need to be tackled in some form of a contingency. They will have to be done based on past experience, So, we ask the next question, why do we manage risk? And the answer is very simple, the time, money and effort spent on risk management is like insurance. Okay? Risk management is an activity undertaken to reduce the impact of a potentially adverse event. It is a form of investment in that, the cost associated with it, will be less than the possible benefits that may accrue because of non-occurrence of the risk. The extent of investment will depend on the nature of the project, the experience of the project team, the constraints involved and the enthusiasm of the client and so on and so forth. Okay. So, the extent of investment, will not basically ever investment in risk management will not exceed the potential benefits that may come out. Now, one measure of organization's commitment to risk management is to see the dedication with which, the data in respect of the risk management is gathered and used. Okay? So, management's dedication in gathering high quality data about the risks and their consequences is a sure indicator that the management is taking the risk management activity very seriously. In case you manage your risks well, what does happen? So, effective risk management can result in significant improvement in the ultimate success of the project by way of having fewer problems, okay, and more expeditious resolution of the problems that do occur. It will also help the stakeholders in understanding the nature of the project and other things that are associated with it. It gets the team members involved in defining the strengths and the weaknesses of the project. It also helps in integrating various project management knowledge areas. Okay. So, selection of a project and establishing a project scope, making estimates, these are good examples where you need to integrate knowledge from several management, what you call project management areas, knowledge areas. Now, there is one word of caution. The good risks often go unnoticed. The crisis management is visible, but the project with well managed risks, is often not noticed. What we say is like a simple example, if a driver of a company executive was on leave and the executive had to take somebody else's car and a driver to drop him at the airport, and midway through the car fails or the petrol tank is empty, and then the driver makes frantic effort to make sure that he has a taxi or calls another car or whatever, and gets the boss to the airport in time, and the boss is very happy at the enthusiasm of our friend and gives him ₹100 tip. The boss never realizes that all these years that his driver takes him to the airport, the car never failed, it was always taken care of, the tanks were full, the oil, whatever else needs to be checked was properly checked, and because there was no crisis, the driver never got either acknowledged or rewarded. In the same sense, a project which has good risk management, you will find that the project will have less crisis, but then it may look like the project is running very smoothly without any particular problems. So the crisis poses obvious dangers to the project, and these result in intense involvement of the team member. Okay, so resolving crisis is more visible. Okay, but so from an outsider's point of view, it may not realize that the project risk is being well managed. Okay, so we say the well-run project seems to run with effortless ease, and that itself is a sign of success of the project. So project risk management basically is a process which is aimed at minimizing the probability and the consequences of adverse events to the project's objective. Project management activity, like other management activities, is done throughout the life of a project. Okay, and the project risk management process is directed at identifying, analyzing and responding to the project risk with the simple intention of meeting the project objectives within the constraints specified. Now, what are the sub processes in risk management? So, let us look at our slide now. Okay. So, first you have a risk management planning process. We will look at all these particular processes in more detail. The second is risk identification process. The third is risk analysis process. The fourth is risk response planning process. Last, risk monitoring and control process. Okay. So now ask the next particular question. What does the risk management planning process do? Risk management planning process, is aimed at deciding how the project will approach the risk, how to approach the risk management activity. Okay. So from our particular point of view, if you look at the slide, we say risk management planning process is aimed at deciding how to approach and to plan for risk management activities in the project. This process ensures that the level, type and the visibility of risk management activity is commensurate with both the risks and the importance of these particular risks to the organization. Okay. Now, what you need to remember again as we look at it, the process does not address response to individual risks. This is not the process which addresses individual risk. Individual risks get addressed to at a later stage, in the risk response planning process. Okay. So, risk management planning process only sort of outlines the organization's approach to tackling the risks. Now, first what you need to do for risk management planning, is to organize a meeting with all the concerned stakeholders. So, the project team should hold the planning meetings, and develop risk management plan. Okay. At this particular meeting, you will get all project manager, team leader, team member, key stakeholders, other project management, or you may have risk management team of the organization, the sponsoring organization or the performing organization. You might even hire external experts and so on and so forth. And once you have done that particular kind of that, then a risk management templates and inputs, may be used to evolve a risk management plan. Now, when you do this particular activity and decide how you are going to tackle that particular job, then at the end of it, you are going to get certain outputs. So, the first output that you will get, is a risk management plan. The first output that we are going to get is a risk management plan. Typically, this particular plan, describes how the risks, identification will take place, how the analysis will take place. both quantitative and qualitative analysis, how the responses will be planned, how they will be monitored, controlled, so on and so forth. Okay. So, it describes general approach to risk management and summarize the findings in the form of risk identification process. Okay. And obviously the risk quantification process. Now, the methodology part of it defines the approach, tools, techniques, data sources that may be used for performing the risk management project. The budgeting need is obviously establishes a budget for project risk management. The roles and responsibilities are defined, and the lead, support, risk management team membership, all such details are finalized. Independent risk management teams may perform the job more unbiasedly, but it may not always be possible for you to have such a team. Timing in terms of when will the risk management will done, how frequently it will done, all those particular things are also equally important. The result should be early enough to affect the decisions, and the decisions should be revisited periodically in the life cycle to make sure that the decisions have been correct. The scoring and interpretation, the method, is the approach for methods and the tools, techniques that you will use for assessment and evaluation of the risks. Thresholds, the risk levels at which the action needs to be taken by whom and in what manner. Usually what happens is there are many things which have a gradual degradation, and the things which have sudden degradation. When you have gradual degradation, we have a problem. Now suppose we have a problem of late coming, then you are going to say that like how late is late enough before you invoke your authority and put your foot down and tell the people to be on time, so that will be a threshold. Okay. So, in many such particular situations, the number of people leaving a project, number of people joining a project, all these particular kind of things can have a threshold. Then the information about the risk management activity needs to be reported. So, the reporting formats also need to be drawn out. Okay. So, how will the risks be documented? They will be analyzed, communicated, all this is to be put in a proper format. Making a plan is not good enough. What is important is you track the plan. So, tracking defines how all the facets of risk management activities will be recorded for the benefit of the current project and future needs, and how will the lessons learned be put in the processes. Okay. So, how you will define, for instance, the risk processes that like how will they be audited, is another important issue. That kind of thing will be done in risk tracking. Now, then another two outputs from risk management planning process, you look at the slide, one is a contingency plan, okay, and the other particular one is going to be contingency reserve. What is the contingency plan? The contingency plan specifies the predefined action that will be put into action should the risk materialize. Remember, we will see another term ahead, mitigation. Okay. So, the mitigation activities are put into our project plan immediately, with immediate effect, whereas the contingency plan is put into effect only if the risks were to materialize. Okay. So, if a project team knows, that the new release of a software is not likely to be available in time, they may have a contingency plan to use a available version of some kind of a software tool, or emulator or simulator or some such particular kind of a thing that will serve the purpose half as good maybe, but it will serve the purpose all right. The contingency reserves are the funds or resources which are kept available, for coping with unexpected, changes that may happen to scope, cost, schedule and quantity. Remember, in case we anticipate something, we take care of it right away, usually in the form of some mitigation action, but whatever the things are residual, like residual error, the residual risks to the particular project, they need to tackle through contingency planning and contingency reserve. Okay. If a project goes off course, then we need to withdraw some credit out of the contingency particular thing. Now, once we have made a risk management plan, the next thing is to go to the next process of risk identification. Okay. If you look at the slide, you say risk identification may affect the project in terms of like classifying what sort of risks are involved, market risks, financial risk, technology risk, So, the risk identification process involves identifying the risks that may be affecting the particular project. There are many ways in which the risks can be classified or grouped or identified for that matter. You can for instance do everything in terms of knowledge areas. Okay. So, you can do the risks associated with the scope management, with the schedule management, with the cost management, so on and so forth. Now, once you got these risks identified, documenting their characteristics is very important. Okay. As we already said, understanding follows by, next particular thing is to be followed by documenting. Okay. So, risk identification involves gaining an understanding of the potentially unsatisfactory outcomes associated with a particular project and what kind of then we will see action to be taken. Now, there are two terms which are very often used associated with risk. One is a risk event. Risk events are specific things that may occur to the detriment of the project. For instance, significant change to the scope of a project, performance failure on the produced product, or delays in work rejection, delays in non-availability of resources, litigations against the organization. All these are basically risk events. Okay. After these risk events are identified, it is important to define like what is their likely probability of occurrence and the consequence, and once you know that particular thing, we need to finalize how to do the planning, as we will see ahead. These details help the project team in deciding their response to specific. Now, another particular concept is event is preceded usually by symptoms. It's like saying that in case you're going to go down with fever, you might get cough and cold as a earlier prior symptoms, By the same particular token, risk symptoms are indicators or triggers for actual risk event. Okay. So, illustration, like take a simple example of symptoms, suppose there are going to be cost overruns on early activities, the early activities in the project show cost overrun. It is going to be an indicator, it is a symptom for maybe understanding that the cost estimates are poor in quality, or inappropriate resource allocation has been done, or the management control is not adequate, etc. Okay, and this particular. So, detection of defective products, itself similarly can be a symptom for poor requirement analysis, poor reviews, inadequate quality planning, low quality suppliers supplying the product of low quality. So, this kind of things can happen. Now, the market risk, will the new product produce a marketable, will it be marketable, will someone else make a similar product, make it available immediately after years, then the financial risk is the whole project affordable, return on investment, payback period, so on and so forth. Technology risk in terms of the technology being, adequate, appropriate, feasible, and all that kind of thing. So, what we find that when you are doing this kind of risk identification, one of the most useful tools that will be available at your disposal will be risk identification checklist. If you were to go on the internet, might find 7,000-8,000 project risks associated with software projects, but not all of them are applicable to each project. Okay. So, the checklist provides the starting point for tailoring the requirements in terms of risk management. Once the source of risks are known, the potential risks can be identified using the techniques like flowchart, fishbone diagram, checklists, interviews, and so on and so forth. Okay, and the risk identification checklists, have been promoted by different groups. For instance, Standish Group or McFarlane and many other particular people have given a specific checklist which can be used associated with the risk management. Now, once we have done the risk identification, next thing we need to do analysis. Okay. Once the risks have been identified, it is essential to assess their impact on the project. The impact of the project need to be assessed in two ways: the qualitative impact and the quantitative. Now, obviously, the quantitative analysis will be more rigorous, but it will cost more and take longer time. So, obviously, it is not likely that you will spend equal amount of time, money and effort on each particular risk that might be associated with the project. So, what qualitative analysis, risk analysis does is to help us in identifying few risks which are of major concern to the organization. Okay, and from that particular point of view, attention can be paid only to those particular risks, for detailed analysis. So, risk analysis is used in all risk related decisions, and answering questions like if the risk is worth reducing, if the what you call proposed solution is economically viable, is the case of multi-risk situation which are the thing. So, we have such particular kind of thing. Now, let us look at first the risk analysis processes, okay, what they are. So, objective of risk analysis process is to help IS management to strike an economic balance between the impact of risk and the cost of protective measures. The risk analysis involves evaluating the risk and risk tolerance, what you call assessing the risk tolerance, risk interaction, so that the likely project outcomes can be detected. Okay. So, the probability of each risk, its impact on the project objectives and its impact on the overall project risks can still be studied very well. Now, when you start this thing, you have to do quantitative and qualitative, as I mentioned to you. So, if you do qualitative risk analysis, the qualitative risk analysis process is aimed at assessing the likelihood and impact of the identified risk. This analysis involves evaluation of the probability and the consequences of risks using established qualitative analysis tools and techniques. Okay. So, it helps you in correcting the biases, if any, in the project plan. The process this particular process prioritizes the risks, the process will prioritize the risk, okay, and which will throw up the importance of the risk and the time criticality associated with this particular risk. The quality of available information, also influences the assessment of the risk kind of activity. So, what do we do now? From this point of onward, we say, okay, we will say the quality of available information, okay, will influence our risk. So, from that point of view, an organization's collection of database in respect of risks becomes a very important particular factor. Now, let us look at an example of how this kind of qualitative analysis can be done. You can have, say, risk impact rating table can be developed. These are the ways means by which some kind of a quantification of the risk can be done based on judgment of the individual. If you look at our slide, then it says that if your project objective is cost, okay, and you say that a particular risk is identified, then we ask a question that what kind of impact will this risk have on the cost, okay, and if the risk is the impact of this particular risk is insignificant, okay, then we say that the risk ranking is very low. If it is, say, less than 5%, 10%, of course, these numbers 5%, 10%, 20% are very relative, subjective, and based on the organization's judgment and the seriousness about those particular factors. We can do exactly similar kind of a thing, associated with the schedule, okay, and then we can do the same particular thing with scope, we can do another thing with quality. So, in this particular manner, we can say take an example of each particular risk and see what will be its impact on each of these particular 4 factors. Say, if you had a risk, that some key people associated with your project will abscond in the middle of the project, then you see what is the impact of that decision on cost, schedule, scope and quality. Now, when we are doing this particular kind of a job, we get output that overall risk ranking of the project, okay, is one particular thing. The list of, see here, this particular aspect goes beyond an individual project. Many times the organizations are, like we have seen in one of the earliest lectures, that project portfolio is a key factor, and from that point of view, a single rating overall risk ranking of the project is very necessary from a organizational point of view. This enables them to compare one project with another particular project. But otherwise, this particular process gives you a list of prioritized risk, the list of, prioritized list of risks. List of risks, for which additional analysis needs to be done, and it shows trends in the qualitative risk analysis results as to, whenever you have done such particular activity, how many risks you have found and how the correct, the impact and the assessment was done subsequently, how much time, money and effort was spent on it. Now, once we have done the qualitative risk analysis, we have identified few risks which need to be analyzed in great deal of details, and for that quantitative risk analysis process will be useful. The key analysis, on this particular thing will be in terms of impact and the likelihood. Okay. So, impact upon materialization of the unfavorable event and the likelihood of such an event occurring are the two major considerations that we have in quantitative analysis. The impact and the likelihoods are estimated by using a combination of historic data, the knowledge about the system and our own experience and judgment. Okay. So, impact, frequency and the risk exposure is something that is of great interest to project manager. For the purpose of risk analysis, estimates in order of magnitude are good enough. Okay. Now, let us look at the slide. Okay. What do you find that if you had an impact of 10 rupees, then the next particular level, the quantum jumps, in terms of we need responses to 100,000, 10,000, so on and so forth. Okay. So, it is possible for us to establish the quantification, get the quantification, to this kind of levels that are possible. Okay. So, rounding off of impact and the likelihood estimates to a factor of 10 will considerably reduce the time needed for doing the analysis. Please remember, the exact data may not be available and exact analysis of risks at this particular stage may not be economically viable. Okay. So, if the impact is so much, then the frequency can be considered in terms of this particular kind of levels. Now, what are the quantitative risk analysis techniques? Some of the well known techniques which I already referred to is expected money value, decision tree analysis, sensitivity analysis, simulation analysis. What is sensitivity analysis? In case you make, it's like if you had an XY curve and you say if you make a small change to X, how great a change does it make to the Y axis, okay? And that would give you sensitivity analysis. In our well known break even chart, you have seen that the curve is more sensitive to the left of the bottom, trough than to the right. Now, there are situations where some risks are of great magnitude, but the probability is very low, and in such situations it is possible for us to group all these particular risks together and take one shot kind of decision. Let's take an illustration. Suppose you are developing a software, okay, and this particular software has a penalty clause associated with it, a very stiff penalty. Now, we have a simple question to answer. Should we do the VV activity or should we contract it outside? Testing and all that particular activity. Shall we take it ourselves or contract it? So, let us see how we can do this using a decision tree. So, say probability that the software has a critical error, is say 0.4. Please remember, the software may not have any bugs at all. Okay. Next, we ask a question: how much is the consequential loss due to critical error? Suppose the critical error does surface. Suppose you say that the loss is 20 billion. We say with the independent VV, what is the probability that the error will be detected? And the answer is 0.95. Okay. The cost of independent VNV activity assume is 1 million, okay, and without independent VFV our catching rate is 80%. So, what we are basically saying is our project teams don't do only testing. So, when they do testing, their catching efficiency is only 80%, but there is an organization, maybe like Disha or somebody, which can do this particular assessment for us, and their catching rate they have projected as 0.95. Now, how do we decide whether to or not to do this particular job? So, look at the slides. Okay. So, we have product. We need to decide whether to or not to do V&V from an outside agency. Of course, doing the testing is going to be done, but whether to give it to an outside agency is the issue. So, now if you look at the slide, what do you see? Now, suppose we decide to do the VV activity ourselves, there are three things can happen. One, there may be no error at all in the software, in which case you will not find it. The probability of there being no error at all is 0.60. Okay. Then we have a particular activity where we will find, say, okay, in case we are talking of doing the VV activity from an outside agency, the data is absent, we have just lost 1 million. In case we find that there is a error, that the probability of there being a error is 0.4, okay, and the probability of that being caught, is 0.95. So, say 0.38 is the chance that there will be an error and it will be cost, and this will still cost us 1 million. If you look here, however, you find that the error, even the external VV specialist may not be able to catch the error. That is a probability of 0.05. Okay. In which particular case, what will happen is you will pay 20 million as a damage plus 1 million to the VV expert. So, you will have spent 21. What happens in case we do it ourselves? Okay. If the error is absent, we spend no money. In case we find the error, we spend no money. In case we find the, don't find the error, then we lose only 0.25. But if you were to now do the probability multiplied by the expected loss, then you find that the first option gives you the expected loss of only minus 1.4 lakhs, whereas the second option gives you an expected loss of minus 1.6. So, normally under these circumstances, your decision will be that it is worth getting the VV job done outside. Okay. Now, this may not be the only way that we take decisions, but this is one particular example of how this job can be done. Another way of tackling risk quantification, is by doing simulation. Typical technique uses Monte Carlo simulation. Okay. What it does is repeats model's outcome several times. Okay. It determines basically if the project will meet its schedule, what can we say, what is the chance that we will meet with 10% probability, 50% probability or 90% probability, okay, to determine if a project will meet its schedule, with 10% confidence or 50% confidence or 90% confidence. So, such particular thing can be done by using the thing. So, if you were to look at the basic steps that are involved in doing a Monte Carlo simulation, they are: first, assess the range of variables and determine the probability distribution of each. Maybe use techniques like optimistic, most likely and pessimistic values and determine the probabilities. For each variable, set a random value based on its probabilities distribution and run the deterministic analysis one pass through the model, and using the combination of values select each variable. Now, this steps 2 and 3 can be repeated a large number of times so that we get a probability distribution for the results. At the end of our risk quantification, we will have come out with a ranked set of risks which need to be tackled by us, on a priority basis. Obviously, all the sundry risks will also have to be tackled, but they will not be dealt with in such a great detail. So, for the identified risks, now we need to plan a response. So, the risk response planning process involves developing options to combat the risks. So, if you look at the slide, it say the risk response planning process involves developing options to combat the risks. Okay. There are several strategies which we can use, we will see them ahead, okay, or we can have backup strategies also which can be chosen from amongst the several strategies that are available, and this will help us in facing our risks. After selecting the appropriate strategy, then specific actions must be developed to implement the strategies that we got in mind. So, the risk response planning includes identification and assignment of responsibilities to individuals or to groups of people for each particular response. Planning alone does not do anything, like identifying and deciding what to do does not itself get it implemented. So, the responsibility has to be specifically assigned to somebody. Effective risk response planning is something that directly determines if the risk will increase or decrease during the project's particular life. Okay. So, if you do the response planning well, then you will find that you will have taken care of these particular situations well. Now, what are the typical kind of strategies that you can follow? So, typical risk response strategies are risk avoidance, risk transfer, risk mitigation, and risk acceptance. Now, let us look at these particular strategies a little more in detail. As the name suggests, the risk avoidance strategy involves eliminating the risk, usually by eliminating its cause, okay, or to protect the project from its impact. So, like not using a particular technology which is available in the market but is not yet very proven. So, you say okay, we will not go by that, we will go by one of the established technologies. So, we have avoided the possibility of a risk arising out of a unknown technology. Okay. Some risks events that occur during the early stages of the project can also be dealt with by clarifying the requirements, obtaining the information, improving the communication, So, what you basically try to do is do everything so that the risk itself will get eliminated. Okay. So, reducing the scope of the project to avoid high risk activities, adding resources or time, adopting familiar approach rather than innovative approach, avoiding an unfamiliar subcontractor, or deallocating a specific team member are some of the defensive actions that we have. It is not possible to avoid all project risks, but some specific project risks can be avoided by planning in this particular manner. The next particular approach is transfer the risk. This is very akin to taking an insurance policy. So, you are trying to transfer your risk from yourself to the insurer. This involves transferring the risk to minimize its impact and shifting the consequence of a risk to a third party together with the ownership of the response. Okay. So, this transfers the responsibility for the risk and does not eliminate the risk itself. Understand the difference between the avoidance and this particular strategy. The risk persists, okay, but is not eliminated, that is transferred. Okay. Suppose a hospital had a problem with retaining systems managers. Okay. They could always think in terms of contracting the job out to a very large company like Tata Consultancy Services, so that what happens is that possibility of people leaving still continues, but this consequence or the dealing with that particular situation is transferred to the agent. Obviously, it costs money to do this particular thing. Okay. So, particularly this is most appropriate form of response to financial risks. In case I do not know whether you can, but you had entered into a clause for penalty clause in the event of failures or consequential cost because of your software, you could always get yourself insured against it. Okay. In airlines industry, for instance, they go one step further, that there are insurers for the aircrafts and there are reinsurers for the aircraft, so that the risk is further subdivided amongst a larger number of participants, than just a few. Now, in general, the risk transfer always involves paying a risk premium. It's akin to paying an insurance premium. So you might have warranties, performance bonds, or whatever else that you might need to respond to in this particular manner. Now, contracts may use this particular risk for fixing a price of the contract to a contractor. If the project design is stable, then what will happen, otherwise particular thing. Okay, so contracts may be used for transferring the risks. So you give this lump sum basis to somebody else to do. You want to develop some critical driver or some such particular software, it is possible for you to subcontract that. Okay? We have different types of contracts, we will see later, reimbursable contracts and many other particular cost plus basis contracts and all that. Now, another particular approach is mitigation. Now, what we are doing basically in mitigation is we are trying to lessen the risk. We are not trying to, the first two approaches, one was not to take it and the other was to shift the responsibility somewhere else. Now, we are trying to reduce the probability of risk and reduce the consequential loss arising out of risks. Okay. So, from our particular point of view, if you were to say, that we need to now look at it from different point of view. Okay. So, if you look at the slide, we have a lessening of the risk associated with the probability into that. So, one approach that we could take would be to reduce the probability of occurrence of the risks. Okay. So, if you are minimizing the probability of occurrence of the risks, we will say then the reducing the frequency of errors or reducing the opportunity to make the errors can both help you in reducing the probability. Okay. So, reducing the frequency of errors can be, for example, enter the data once instead of several times, so that the integrity loss is not there. So, suppose we have this illustration, that we are interested in lessening the risks of improper data entry, then we can reduce the frequency of error by making the data entry only once, and then making sure that we use this data rather than re-entering the data ever again. Reducing the opportunity for making error, can be done by, say, adding data validation routines or check digits to the data, so that the person cannot make a mistake, in that particular sense. Now, if you look at the slide again, then other particular objective approach is to reduce the loss that may arise. So, if you can't tackle the probability, we try to reduce the loss. Okay. So, that can be done by minimizing the exposure to loss or minimizing the impact of loss. So, if you are interested in minimizing the exposure to loss, so we can have 2 computer rooms instead of 1, so that in case there is a problem, then one of the 2 areas will still be available, for doing the data entry or any other particular activity. Now, in case you are interested in minimizing the impact of loss, we can have insurance for computer room loss. Okay, but this kind of examples, will only give you an illustration as to what kind of things can happen. So, basically, what we are saying is our aim at mitigation activity, is at reducing the either probability of occurrence or the likely loss due to occurrence of that particular thing. So, you say mitigation actions are aimed at preventing the risks from materializing or to reducing their impact. Okay. So, reducing the probability or whatever other things that we have seen. These actions are result oriented, they address the cause. The mitigation action, gets scheduled, when they are identified. Mitigation actions are put into the project plan as soon as they are identified. Remember, we prepare 2 types of plans, the contingency plan and the mitigation plan. The mitigation plan is put in the project plan immediately, whereas the contingency plan is kept ready, and only if things go wrong, we put the contingency plan into the project plan. That is a post facto kind of a situation. So, mitigation may involve changing the conditions, so that the probability of risk is reduced. Okay. So, can also use for reducing the impact by targeting linkages to severity. Many other particular things can be done in this particular fashion. What are the typical kind of a risk mitigation strategies that are associated with software project? 1. You can increase the frequency of project monitoring. Obviously, project monitoring is an overhead, it consumes time, money and effort, it slows down the project to some extent. Okay. So, increasing the frequency is going to have a, in that particular sense, a small negative impact, but the chances are that something going wrong will be caught earlier. Okay. So, increasing frequency of project monitoring, increasing the project manager's authority can be another particular way of mitigating the strategy. Using work breakdown structures and techniques like PERT CPM in a formal sense can also reduce the chances of making a mistake. We can improve communications. That is another big area where the risks arise, and increased or improved communication may definitely lead to reduced risk likelihoods. Okay. The emphasizing on team support, getting everyone involved, using risk or standalone project structure as against getting some other project goals understanding clarified. All these are aimed at emphasizing that the team support is there. Okay. If you have technical risks, then we will say, okay, avoid a standalone project structure. We will have it there are many different ways in which we can organize this particular project. Okay. In case you want cost reduction kind of a thing, you can improve the project's goal understanding, so that the people do the job properly. Strategies for schedule risks can be tackled by selecting the most experienced project manager or many other particular considerations. Now, what is the last particular kind of a job that we have? Last is we live with the risks, risk acceptance. It's like saying, okay, we'll see if we come to it, then we'll take care of it. Okay. Risk acceptance, of course, may be taken in the calculated way. This particular strategy may be adopted in a calculated way, but it means that basically knowing that there is something likely to go wrong, you say, there's always a chance that it may not go wrong, and you go ahead with it. Okay. You're starting on a rare technology project, then this is a good particular way. There may not be enough training material available, trained instructors available, trained replacements available, and so many other particular problems will be, and we'll say we'll live with those particular problems and handle them if and when they arise. This involves deciding to accept the consequences if the risk should materialize. Okay. No specific strategy is found useful. So, we say, okay, if our people leave, we'll go to one of the headhunters, and pay him whatever money he asks and say that by tomorrow we need people of this particular kind of background available with us. Active acceptance of risk involves preparation of a contingency plan. That is, if things go wrong, what we will do. Okay. Which is executed if the risk materialize. Okay. So, preparing the contingency plan is a advanced kind of a to make sure that we don't start thinking after the things have gone wrong. Okay, kind of a approach. Remember, preparing the contingency plan is a part of the risk management activity. Even if you want to build the expense to in that sense to the project management, it's not exactly like a risk mitigation activity, but making a contingency plan is a very essential kind of thing. You might sometimes have a fallback plan. You say, prepared if the risk strategy is weak. Then change the scope of the project, choose another alternative. Go to another site, go to another project manager, allot more contingency funds. So this kind of backup or fallback plans can also be there. We can also use triggers, for tracking such risks, and we say if things appear to go dwindling in a particular manner, then we'll take. So we have a team of 100 and we are worried about the project members leaving the team, and we say, okay, if this particular number of people leaving the project exceeds 5, we need to put a contingency plan into action. Okay. But remember, risk acceptance does not mean not thinking about it. It only means that we think and consciously take a decision that we would not like to have another particular mitigation activity or other situation. So, if you look at the slide now, the contingency action. The contingency actions are aimed at limiting and containing the impact of risk if they happen. Okay. And from that point of view, in case a customer hardware is not in place that for acceptance testing, it may be performed by hiring resources at the alternative side. Okay. So, similarly, if the hardware is not going to be available for testing, you could think in terms of using a emulator for doing that particular job. These actions get identified during the planning stage. Okay. However, they are not going to be put into practice at early stage. Now, once we got this strategy planned, the next thing is monitoring and controlling the risks. So, again looking at the slide, we say risk monitoring and control is an ongoing process which operates throughout the life of the project. Okay. As the project progresses, new risks may emerge, anticipated risks may disappear, or some risks may persist. So, it is not a one time kind of activity. The risk response owner should therefore periodically report to the project manager about the effectiveness of the risk response plan, okay, and any unanticipated effects, side effects that may be happening. Okay. Mid-course corrective action can also be taken in case of many risk plans that we have. This process basically records the risk metrics associated with the implementation of contingency plans. Okay. So, we say a good risk monitoring and control process should provide data that will assist in taking preemptive actions in the face of the risks. Okay. Now, in industry, typical approach that is used is tracking top 10 risks. Again, the number 10 is not sacrosanct, whether it should be 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, depends on the size of the project and many other particular kind of things. Okay. So, what we say that the top 10 risks will be monitored very critically. It involves establishing a periodic review for project's most significant risks items, and appropriate stakeholders are involved in doing the review. The review begins with a summary of the status of the 10 project risks. Every time you sit for a review, see the status of these 10 risks. Each item, find out what is its current ranking, and the items may keep on changing their ranking up and down, number of times it has appeared in the list. Suppose you find that a particular risk keeps on appearing in the top 10 risks, for long time, it means there is a more serious problem associated with that particular area. Then the progress is made in resolving this particular risks, should also be reported. This review achieves several objectives. First, it keeps the stakeholders aware of the major influences that impeding the project's progress. Okay. Alternative mitigation actions can also be considered at the suggestions of the stakeholders, and it promotes the confidence by demonstrating to the stakeholders that the project team is not sitting on its backside, but is very conscious of the significant risks, and it has got the contingency plan ready for this particular situation. Now, let us look at an illustration. Okay. So, if you look at the slide again, okay, gives you a typical format. Suppose we had 4 risks, one is inadequate planning. If you look at the slide, we have inadequate planning, okay. Then we have poor scope definition, then absence of leadership, okay, poor cost estimates and poor time estimates, are the risk items, and we want to sort of do a monthly risk ranking for this particular thing. Okay. So, we would like to have this month's ranking and last month's ranking, and then we would like to find out how long has this particular risk perpetuated in the top 10 risks table, and last but not the least, what kind of a risk resolution progress should be there. Okay. Then we find that we have risk ranking of this particular type, inadequate planning, this month it is number 1, last month it was number 2. It has been in top 10 list for last 4 months out of so many whatever we have. Similarly, we can do that job for poor scope definition and on for other particular things, and from that we will get the idea as to what is or what is not going wrong with our particular project, and where if at all some kind of a corrective action is required on the risk front.